Rwanda's history is deeply intertwined with a complex system of hierarchical relationships that shaped its society for centuries. From as early as the 15th century, the Kingdom of Rwanda was governed by a feudal-like structure dominated by the Tutsi ruling class. This system enforced a rigid stratification of society, placing the majority Hutu population under the control of Tutsi elites, with oppression manifesting through forced tributes, labor obligations, and systemic inequalities. The social hierarchy in pre-colonial Rwanda. Rwandan society during this period was organized along socio-economic and ethnic lines, with the Tutsi, Hutu, and Twa forming distinct groups. The Tutsi minority held political and economic power, while the Hutu majority, primarily farmers, were subservient to them. The Twa, a small group of hunter-gatherers, were marginalized and existed on the fringes of society. The Tutsi were traditionally associated with cattle herding, a prestigious activity in Rwandan culture. Ownership of cattle symbolized wealth, power, and status. In contrast, the Hutu were primarily agriculturalists who worked the land. Although intermarriage and cultural exchange blurred the lines between these groups over time, the Tutsi maintained dominance, particularly in the political sphere. The Ubuhake system, a feudal framework. At the core of this hierarchical structure was the Ubuhake system, a socio-economic arrangement that resembled feudalism. Under this system, a Hutu farmer or client would enter into a contract with a Tutsi patron. In exchange for access to land or cattle, the Hutu was obligated to provide agricultural labor, military service, and tributes in the form of crops or livestock. Cattle as a tool of control. Cattle were central to the Ubuhake system. Since land was often held communally, cattle ownership became a primary means of asserting power. The Tutsi elite controlled large herds of cattle, distributing them strategically to cement loyalty and dependency among Hutu clients. Without cattle, a Hutu farmer had little hope of achieving social mobility or economic stability. Tributes. Hutu farmers were required to provide regular tributes to their Tutsi patrons. These tributes included crops such as bananas, beans, and sorghum, as well as labor on the Tutsis' land. The tributes were often excessive, leaving little for the farmers' families to survive on. Forced labor. In addition to tributes, Hutu farmers were compelled to work on public and private projects, including building roads, cultivating the Tutsis' fields, or herding their cattle. This labor was often uncompensated and came at the expense of the farmers' own livelihoods. Oppression and inequality. The Ubuhake system entrenched social and economic inequality. Tutsi rulers used their control over resources, particularly cattle, to maintain dominance over the Hutu majority. The system created a cycle of dependency that left Hutu farmers perpetually subordinate. The imbalance of power was further reinforced by political structures, as the Tutsi held key positions in the royal court and local governance. Political control. The Tutsi monarchy and its network of chiefs and sub-chiefs controlled all aspects of life in the kingdom. They adjudicated disputes, allocated land, and collected tributes. Hutu farmers had little say in the governance of their communities, as power was concentrated in the hands of Tutsi elites. Economic exploitation. The heavy demands placed on Hutu farmers reduced them to a state of perpetual poverty. They were often forced to neglect their own fields to fulfill their obligations to their patrons, leading to food insecurity and economic hardship. Resistance and resilience. Despite the systemic oppression, Hutu farmers found ways to resist and adapt. Acts of subtle defiance, such as withholding tributes or working inefficiently, were common. Some Hutu also sought refuge in more egalitarian neighboring regions or formed alliances to resist exploitation. However, these efforts were often suppressed by the Tutsi elite, who used their control over military forces to maintain order. At the same time, cultural practices and shared rituals helped maintain a sense of unity among the population. Both Tutsi and Hutu participated in communal ceremonies and shared linguistic and religious traditions, which blurred ethnic divisions at the grassroots level. These shared cultural elements often masked the underlying tensions created by the Ubuhake system. The role of external factors. From the 16th century onward, external influences began to shape Rwandan society. Regional trade networks brought new goods and ideas, but they also reinforced existing power dynamics. The demand for cattle, ivory, and other resources from the region's rulers increased the burden on Hutu farmers, as Tutsi elites sought to meet the demands of foreign traders. Additionally, neighboring kingdoms, such as Burundi and Buganda, engaged in periodic conflicts with Rwanda, exacerbating the exploitation of Hutu farmers. During times of war, Hutu men were conscripted into the military, while their families were left to bear the brunt of increased labor demands. The legacy of feudal oppression. The feudal-like oppression of the Tutsi-Hutu dynamic in pre-colonial Rwanda left a deep imprint on the country's history. While the Ubuhake system began to decline in the late 19th century due to the influence of European colonization, the inequalities it created persisted. Colonial powers, particularly Germany and later Belgium, co-opted and exacerbated these divisions, formalizing ethnic categories and entrenching Tutsi dominance in the colonial administration. The legacy of this oppression would have devastating consequences in the 20th century, as long-standing grievances and inequalities fueled cycles of violence and conflict, culminating in the Rwandan genocide of 1994. Conclusion: the feudal system in Rwanda, centered around the Ubuhake structure, was a tool of oppression that entrenched inequality and dependence. The Tutsi ruling class used their control over cattle, land, and labor to exploit the Hutu majority, creating a society marked by stark divisions. While these systems eventually faded, their legacy continued to shape Rwanda's socio-political landscape for centuries, leaving scars that are still being addressed today.